Morning all. We have a hybrid event that we're doing this morning. So there's a room with a mix of business, leadership, and techies to talk about the topic of DevSecOps. With me, we have Donovan Mulder, CEO of Kinetic Skunk. Donovan, thank you for hosting. And we've got Gavin Rousseau, who's the head of IT innovation at Old Mutual Investment Group. Welcome. Good. And I'm going to be checking my laptop because we're expecting one more panelist to be dialing in as well. Okay. The format for the day, we are trying to simplify the concept of DevSecOps. There are no doubt going to be questions that come up, regardless of how familiar you are with the topic. But I think maybe one of the first things that we want to do is just get a sense of exactly that, how familiar you are with the topic. So if you're able to, you can whip out your phone and scan the QR code. That includes whoever's in the room here as well. Or just go to menti.com. If you can type in menti.com. And there's a code that you can enter. Code is 62577632. Okay, just show of hands when you are on. Yep, so the code is 62577632. Just scan the QR code. Thanks. Okay, so looks like we've got a group that's connected. 10 of you connected so far. Feel free to keep connecting. Given that we're talking to an audience that consists of developers as well, let's just do a quick test to make sure that the system works. So in your own words, your own languages, that includes programming languages, just say hello. I've got hello world up in the screen here. See what we're seeing as well. Yeah. That includes syntax. And if you just joined, you connect to the Menti, we will be using it through the course of the talk. Go to menti.com and you can enter the code 62577632 to connect. Yeah. 62577632. To those online, can you hear us? Just doing a quick sound check. If you give a thumbs up or something in the chat message. Thanks, Tariq. Yeah, we'll be checking my laptop. We've got one of the panel members due to join still. So we'll be checking that every now and then. Okay, good. So we know that Menti is working. What I'd like to ask as a next question is, where are you on your DevSecOps journey. So the options here are: I'm a complete newbie, I have some theoretical knowledge, I have implementation experience, or I consider myself at guru status. What would you say?
I would say, personally, I still have a lot to learn, right? But I think we're well on our way to achieving maturity.
So feel free to be as honest as possible. Nice thing about Menti is it is anonymous. We've got 15 responses so far. You can see that it is quite dominant towards newbies. We've got a couple on the call who have implementation experience, and we actually have no idea whether this is split between those in the room or those who are online. Okay, so quite clear that we have a large contingent in the audience that are new to the topic, so that's pretty awesome. What we'll do is we'll leave this question panel open so that if you want to ask questions through Menti, you can. Otherwise, and that way we don't know who's asking, so be as candid as you want. But we also have the chat and Q&A panel on Teams, if you prefer to do it that way. Okay, so let's start with the basics, given that we've got a new audience, predominantly new audience. DevSecOps, what does it stand for, firstly? Donovan?
Development, security, operations.
Okay. And if I were to start the debate, which one of those is the most important?
Given my testing background, I'm going to say testing, but obviously not just testing for functional defects. I'm talking about software quality. And from my perspective, it is it's no longer a function of the absence of defects. It's a function of security. It's a function of stability in the application or the service and infrastructure.
Okay. You note that I said DevSecOps, not DevSecTestOps, right?
It can only be better if there's enough quality assurance built into that pipeline.
Okay, so there's always a need for more quality assurance. I get it. Gavin, DevSecOps in terms of context, right? Where does this fit in? Obviously within a software development lifecycle. Tell us a little bit about that lifecycle and maybe your perspective of it from Old Mutual Investment Group.
Yeah, thanks. So DevSecOps is like this weird portmanteau that we've put together to create a thing around it. It's an old thing that we've been doing in the software engineering world for years. It's release early, release often, release safely. It's pretty, like, the reality is we've been doing this for such a long time. We're now moving into creating a new word around it, and I mean, we all know there's various ops. There's the product ops, and then the DevOps, and now the DevSecOps. Just before this, I was Googling a bunch of stuff because I was trying to figure out what the hell DevSecOps actually is and what it looks like out in the world. And I ended up with a panel cartoon around a Triceratops, which was great. But it's there's a lot of stuff out there around it, and it's really, if you boil it down, it's the simplicity. It's release early, release often, release safely. Like that's what you want. Donovan and I, before we got here, we were talking about a place where if you can only release once a year, you can't release safely. The amount of risk that you introduce by releasing on so few cycles is massive. Like every line of code has inherent risk. And so if you're releasing giant reams of code once a year, the risk just goes absolutely through the roof. So something like DevSecOps, you have to make sure you have pipelines in place so that, and this is still a dream of a environment I'd like to end up in, which is you should be able to get a new person in to join your team. And at the end of day one, they should be able to do a live release into production. Now, the systems they need to be in place to be able to do that so that they can do that safely, that's where the DevSecOps discipline comes in. And I'm not talking about the the Microsoft DevOps, which is immensely entertaining to me. They've literally taken Team Foundation Services, renamed it DevOps. Now a bunch of people think they're doing DevOps when they're just using Team Foundation Services. It's an interesting, weird thing that's happened. But to be able to set things up in a way that you can release safely around persons, be concerned about bringing down an entire production system. And we've all heard the stories. Everyone's brought down, well, maybe not everyone, maybe it's just me. But I know a lot of people that have brought down live production systems. That shouldn't be possible. And that's where the sec part, and like you were saying earlier, the testing part becomes critical to be able to do that effectively. I also realize that I'm rambling on a tangent here. It's a nasty habit of mine. I can't answer questions quickly.
That's fine, as long as what you're saying is relevant, right? Okay, so let's take it a step back. So there's a question that came up on the Menti. What is DevSecOps? So we know it stands for Development Security Operations. The second is assuming that security needs to be a component, something to consider. There's an argument whether security should be first and the dev and ops should follow with it from a security first perspective. But this started at DevOps and then evolved into that, right? Was there something before DevOps, Donovan?
It was called release management or build or software build management. So before DevOps became a thing, I was working for a for the world's largest privately owned IT company. And in the testing team, so I was a test manager, and the test team, I realized that from environment to environment, we had problems, right? Going from dev environment to QA, pre-prod, and prod. So then I thought to myself, okay, maybe we need a build manager in the test team to manage so are not really mirror images, but as close as possible. So when we move from one environment to the next one, we don't have a lack of testability due to environment issues. And that we call that build management, right? And we automated that process. Obviously the automated tests, etc., kind of thing, right? And a few years later, and I think it was 2007, 5, 6, 7 years later, build management became DevOps. Yeah, so they have always, in my opinion, it's always been a flavor of it. It's just maybe the word DevOps got slapped onto it with the advent of microservices and been able to get devs to actually release software-based services or product into production without needing to do a formal request to a ops team.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. So now we're at a point where there is something that's fairly mature called DevSecOps. Let's focus on the methodology. We'll talk about methodology. We'll talk about tools. There's a question that came up around how do you get started. Let's start with the methodology. What is it? What is it actually? Is it a system? Is it a process? Is it a mindset? Is it a group of people? How do you actually make sense of what this is? A little bit about the methodology, perhaps?
You're wholly unqualified to talk about this, but I'll take it anyway. A lot of these things come down to the people that are doing the work, doing the releases. And if you have the right people that think in the right way, so like you were saying earlier around the mindset is what you need. That for me, that's the most critical. If you have people that don't think in that release early, release often mindset, you then end up with a lack of DevOps in your environment. So you end up with the standard old school copy paste deploys and hope things don't crash and someone going off doing backups and that sort of stuff. So you have to change the mindset and you have to bring that the thinking in. Everything else for me is very much secondary behind that. You can't do this without people thinking the right way. You can't do it without people wanting to be visible. It's where one of my personal favorite things is agile with a capital A, not with the small a, is for me, the primary tenet there is visibility. And that's what you're trying to do with the DevOps and the mindset behind it. And again, I think the important thing here is when something goes wrong, and it will go wrong, like none of us work for NASA. We have error lines, like it happens. It's how you recover from that and how you're able to make that visible so that you can recover from those things quite quickly. And don't shy away from the visibility. And also from a leadership perspective, don't try and punish people making things visible. I've seen that as a bad habit in the past, and that will kill anything like this very, very quickly. The second somebody is punished for making a fault visible, those faults become invisible and far more dangerous. And it's a hell of a lot easier for that to tear a system down. So, and again, for me, it's mindset, visibility, and there needs to be strong leadership around it. And the leadership is also, it's encouraging people to experiment, to try things, to, get things wrong. Hopefully not that often, but also to get things right.
Okay.
Because without the willingness to get something wrong, you will never end up with getting something right in the long run. I think it becomes quite an easy test about whether you've transitioned into a DevOps, DevSecOps way of working. And the test is if you're doing a demo of your software system that you created, and you're demoing it to, let's say, your MD, your CEO, your largest clients, will you stop your team from releasing and implement a code freeze before you do that, or will you not do that? For me, that's the test.
Okay.
Because if you can, and I've done it before, I've done a demo off of a live system that I knew they were releasing on. And I specifically didn't tell my team because we already knew what would happen. We knew that it would be fun. And at that point, once you can get to that point, you're quite mature. And there's lots of other ways to test it, but it's a simple test. Like if you're prepared to release while your team, or prepared to demo live while your team is releasing, you're probably quite mature in this environment.
Okay. Is it? Thanks, Gavin. So is it possible to then have, let's say, some subset of what's being developed that is running along a DevOps or DevSecOps, let's say, framework and methodology, and another subset that isn't yet? Yeah. Okay. So that's a case of knowing where to prioritize, but also where that transparency, the visibility, and the accountability that comes with it will have the biggest impact. Yeah. Donovan, let's talk about impact. I think we made a comment recently that DevOps is a marketing discussion also, and it's a brand discussion also. It's a boardroom discussion also. What's your view on the cost of getting it wrong, the cost of software defects?
If we just look at just the cost of software defects, we don't have to discuss security or vulnerability related defects. So IBM and a few other research institutions, universities, etc., pushed out the metric that let's say it's maybe $10 to fix a bug found while the dev is writing code. Right, so, and it goes up to $1,000 in QA, $100,000 to fix in production. I think that research came out in the early 2000s. I think my own research paper from with something with similar metrics. Right, so obviously it costs a lot. One thing I can recall when I think in 2012 EU bailed out Greece. Few 100 billion euros, but in that same year, the EU economy bugs or defects cost the economy over 300 billion euros. right? There are other companies, this trading company, like something in the US. They were doing trades, high volume trades, automated trades. Someone released the fix but in the evening, in the morning, they were bankrupt, down 400 million. And by the afternoon, there was a management buyout. Okay, so that's those are obviously the extreme cases. And then, like, following certain people on LinkedIn, reading their articles or links to articles. There hardly recently, there's hardly a day going by where there hasn't been some kind of breach, right? And also stats around that. Companies experiencing a breach tend to go out of business within 24 months. Obviously, depending on the size of the business, like large businesses can rebrand and recover. Smaller businesses don't have that luxury. So it is expensive, it is costly. It can tank companies, ruin your reputation in the market, etc. Look at mobile apps. If your app takes more than, and this is again around about 2012 research again, because I was doing a lot of research then. There was a stat that if your app took more than 3 seconds to load, whoever experienced that lack of performance, 60% of them within 1 minute have downloaded your competitor app, right? And they're not going back to your app if your competitor gets it wrong. They're going to go to the next one, the next one, the next one. So the costs are quite quite extensive. And that ransomware seems to be the most common malicious or attack that's going around. And that again, costs companies billions, if not globally trillions at the moment.
Yep. Okay. Sounds expensive getting it wrong. Obviously, in some industries, you can't legally, or from a regulatory perspective, you can't afford to get it wrong, because then the fines will be following you as well. Are there any questions in the room at this time? Anybody sitting here? Yes.
Sorry, just wanted to touch on what Mr. Gavin touched on earlier.
Mr. Gavin's my dad.
He's what he touched on earlier.
Do you want
to? So as I was saying, I just want to touch on what he said earlier about holds and making holds visible as soon as possible. Would that also tie into the cost of bug fixes and defects, as Mr. Mulder just explained, and what you said earlier about managers and leadership not punishing the developers for those costs? So is it safe to say that, as you say, that the faults need to be made visible and not hidden? Because one might say, okay, so I've introduced a bug to the program now, and I might get punished for it, and it's going to cost the company even more. So instead of brushing it under the carpet and hoping no one notices. So yeah, is it linked to what you were saying earlier, that it's better to make it visible sooner rather than later?
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, touches on too. Something that like most of my teams have heard me rant about before is, and as I said earlier on, none of us here work for NASA. So NASA is they've got it's a metric known as KLOC, which is 1,000 lines of code, and they've got the lowest number of defects per 1,000 lines of code. That's essentially what they measure it. And then there's a monetary value that they associate per line of code, how much it costs them to get to that. So they're the best. They once lost the moon rover, literally lost it. It was on the moon, was out on a circuit, and went out of range. That was a software bug. Somebody was working in miles, they were actually working in kilometers. It literally just went out of range. So was that visible? Very visible, very quickly. There's a lot of people then had to try to figure out how. A lot of very, very smart people came together to do that. So do these things need to be visible? Absolutely. And also, like, I don't know if there's anyone here, but we don't actively go out to write bugs into code. Like, at least not that many people I work with do that. But again, every time you write a line of code, there's a potential there for there to be a bug. It always happens. And again, we can pretend that it doesn't, and like how we make things better and more secure and all those things. But every line of code is a vulnerability. It's back to the tenet of there's two ways of doing things. One is you make it so that nothing is obviously wrong, or you make it so that nothing is wrong obviously. Code simply, and it's easier to figure out if there's something wrong. Write code in a more complex way, and it's easier to obfuscate if something's wrong, and it's harder to find the issues. That's just again, it's to the mindset piece. But you need to have, from a leadership perspective, you need to have a willingness to allow your teams to make their work visible. And it's a hard transition to make, because I think, and this is me, not anyone else, that nobody actually wants to make their work visible upwards. And from a top-down level, they want to make sure that their people aren't making mistakes. But the problem is there's a clash between those two things. Because if you make a mistake, it's going to end up bad. You're not going to publish those mistakes. Like, absolutely not. Why would you? There's no upside to it for anyone in that, for the leadership as well as for the person making the mistakes. So the person up, send that upwards. Now, I've, to my own detriment, have very much made those things visible in most of the places where I work. You make things visible that aren't working, as well as things that are working. I think that's an important piece. Is you can't just punish when things go wrong. Like you have to reward when things go right as well. And it's like, well done, that was excellent, or you stepped in, you solved something. I think there's a disproportionate reward being placed on someone getting something right versus someone getting something wrong. Like a small thing going wrong is often punished more harshly than a big thing going right is rewarded. And I know it annoys me when I keep saying it. It's about visibility. It's all it is. Like a lot of this is actually quite simple. Like make as many things visible as possible, because unless it's visible, you can't do anything to protect yourself from it or to mitigate against it. You're saying like hiding things and hoping that they don't get found. And like, I mean, hope isn't a great strategy for how this works. Like, an error will always be found. The problem is it might be found in a year's time. And to Donovan's point earlier, at that point, it becomes incredibly expensive to fix. And if you can only do a release cycle once a year, you're ending companies like that. And it's not a great look on the dev. So rather make things, if you find something early, bring it up, work with your team, work with your manager, work with the line manager, like up to board level if you need to. And again, like the exco at most companies, they also want to know what is actually going on. I think feedback that I've received from a number of excos is that they only hear when projects are in the process of failing. Up until they're in the process of failing, they're hearing about the success of the project. So from their point of view, they're seeing this massive upward trajectory. And there's probably warning signs along the way, like a lot of warning signs. But say the last Exco update, they saw it on a high. The next Exco update, it's very, very low. And in the space of like 2 weeks, all of a sudden, everything's fallen apart. At that point, members from Exco generally start losing trust and they start trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And that's also, it's a big thing.
Thanks, Gavin. We do have a couple more questions in here. I think we'll weave it into the topic. So we've spoken a little bit about mindset and methodology. Obviously, there are tools, right? There are software tools involved. So can we talk a little bit about which tools are out there? Is it a whole suite of tools, or is there one that caters for quite a bit of what you're doing? At the same time, there's a question that came up saying, can you talk about the SEC in DevSecOps, the security side? How important is that? Is that embedded? Is it automated? Or is that, do you always need a specialist to be involved in setting things up? So Donovan, do you want to attack that first?
Sure. Okay, so tools, methodologies that we can use to implement the SEC in DevSecOps. Right, so I'm just going to go a bit on the technical side of it. So in your software delivery pipe, there's certain things that you can do straight off the bat. So Gavin mentioned earlier about writing simple code. How do you write simple code? If you write unit tests and you follow something such as solid principles, right? So single responsibility, etc. You tend to write less complex code because you have to write testable code, right? And then you can measure the code coverage, etc. So that helps to mitigate quite a bit of the risk. Then you can run that code. You can scan your third-party dependencies for known vulnerabilities as part of the pipeline, right? You can scan the code that is written to make sure that it adheres to certain standards. So the code that you write doesn't introduce a known vulnerabilities, or you don't use patterns of design that's known to be vulnerable, right? Focusing on microservices, maybe it needs to run in Docker containers. You can scan the containers for known vulnerabilities as well. You can take an approach to use Alpine Linux, where the container or the version or Alpine Linux itself has nothing installed. But I mean, what I mean by nothing, it doesn't even have Bash installed. So you only build it according to what you need to build the software and run the software, right? Or run the service. So all of that you can automate quite easily in a software delivery pipeline, and it will give you a fair amount of security straight off the bat, right? So the security in DevSecOps is something that I refer to, or we refer to as sort of inside-out security. The other part of security is perimeter security, but for the perimeter to be breached, or if it's breached prior to the firewall or anything else, you want to make it as difficult as possible for an intruder to gain access. Right, so sort of like lines of defense, right, that you're putting in. Other stuff that you can automate in your pipeline is the OWASP top 10 for APIs, for web, etc., SQL injection, cross-site scripting. And again, all of these can be automated and be part of your software delivery pipeline. So it actually becomes an exercise in risk mitigation. And those are practical steps that any business or any software development company can implement quite easily in their software delivery pipelines without much overhead. The overhead comes when management has to make decisions about, are we actually going to fix this, right, versus the requirements, right? So generally in Agile, fixing a defect versus a requirement during sprint planning tends to get the same weight, but time to market. So management or business, they want things in the market as quickly as possible. So then it's time to market pressures. Right? Do we fix this bug, or do we achieve the time to market that we want? Right? But what management would like, and Gavin alluded to this, they need to understand the risk profile of what's being deployed to make an informed decision. And that's why you build these phases, let's call it quality checks. And when I say quality, I'm including security issues, vulnerabilities and stuff like that. You build that in, management gets a report, right? And they can use that to say, okay, let's go live, or no, we have to fix this, these defects have to be fixed. and that risk report can be tied back to risk to business, right? But again, that's actually built on quite a bit of maturity. So us as software engineers, our responsibility in today's market or today's climate is to enable management to make those decisions. And that's sort of the SEC part in DevSecOps.
Okay.
For me, it is.
Good, thank you. Paul's joined us. Paul from VP of Engineering from Intersect. Paul, I guess as a way of introducing yourself as well, tell us a little bit about how DevSecOps gets used in your business. And
Sure.
maybe you can weave in a little bit about how a company can get started that has no experience in this space. I'm just gonna, you can unmute yourself, and I'm just going to put
I
your
am
screen to the
unmuted.
side.
Thank you.
Just a sec.
Hi. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Mervyn. So that's actually quite an interesting question to answer because Intersect is on a journey to become PCI DSS compliant at the moment. And so we've moved traditionally as an organization from building products that you would host in your data center. And there was a portion of that infrastructure that we had in the cloud, some shared services, etc. And we craftily managed to avoid certain audits and certifications by encrypting the data end to end. So the end customer and the SDK on their device, via a mechanism we call today mutual TLS, we would encrypt the institution, the financial institution's data, and vice versa. And because we were stateless and we were never storing that data, we avoided quite a lot of compliance and regulation. Now our business has changed, and we are moving towards a SaaS operation, and our products include certain authentication solutions. Those of you that know us may well know, chances are good you know us without actually knowing us through your banking app. Most of the major South African banks use our software. When you're being asked to authenticate a transaction, if you're either asked to press a 0 or a 9 via some sort of USSD type of interface, or whether you ask directly in the app, that's sort of our legacy, our legacy business, our auth solutions. But additionally, we have payment solutions. One of them is 3D Secure, an ACS server that we traditionally put into your institution. Now we're hosting these things in the cloud, and of course we're embarked on a journey of getting PCI DSS certification. Of course, this involves DevSecOps. So in essence, we had to start from the beginning. And so in so doing, we've had to create infrastructure. Of course, we did penetration testing, which is one of the things that you're required to do. We use security best practices. We do threat modeling. Threat modeling is wonderful. If you're working in an agile organization, it works very well. And so we had all of those in place already as part of our coding standards and our infrastructure. And so now we've had to create basically a data security kind of infrastructure in our hosted cloud services. So we basically had to get some specialists. I think that's key. It's such a vast undertaking. We're not a big organization. We're sitting around about 200 staff. So the skills weren't really readily available. Fortunately, we work remotely, and we've hired some excellently skilled staff to help us on the journey. And we basically, using GitLab, we're building these CI/CD pipelines that are automated, that involve all the security scanning steps, your SAST, your DAST, everything else. And then we have had to more recently separate our operations from our dev physically, because PCI DSS requires this, and there's actually a hands-off that takes place. And there's a sec with our builders, our runners, and they basically build the source code from the repository directly, and then deploy it in. So not an easy undertaking. I think a lot of it has to do with skill and getting the right skill set in. Of course, GitLab has helped enormously in the process as well. They have, those of you that know GitLab, they have a PCI DSS certification, and our compliance officer has been working with our account manager at GitLab to make sure that we have all the right steps in place for that.
Okay, thanks so much, Paul. Okay, so we've touched on methodology, we've touched on some tools. You've mentioned GitLab, obviously being I think it's one of the first or the first all-in-one DevOps platform.
Yeah, they are a single app. They provide a single app, DevSecOps or DevOps platform. According to Gartner.
Okay.
According to Gartner, they're the leaders by far in that area. Gartner recently created a DevSecOps quadrant, and GitLab, they are
Shot to the top.
Yeah, they're shot to the top. It's straight off the bat.
Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar, that's obviously one of the software considerations of platforms to help manage a methodology like this. I remember us having a discussion. You were talking about in a former life, you felt like you were master of your little universe with 10 different applications that you need to know, and data flows and integration and all of these things. But this obviously simplifying life. There is another question.
Sure.
The question is, I'm probably the least technical person on the call. A business may have different apps and dev teams. Are there some applications where this approach is not ideal or inappropriate? Who wants to tackle that?
I'll do.
Go for it.
Yeah, so if your applications or software-based services integrate, it's exposed to the public, or you're exposed to some user base, that which is probably 10 out of 10. Even if you're just doing systems integration between applications for a telco or a retailer, etc., you do not want to introduce vulnerabilities into your clients or into your organization. So for me personally, I find it nearly impossible to think of an application where it is inappropriate. Right? Recently, I saw a new startup that just started. Well, startup has started maybe a month or two ago, or maybe but they started this year, and their focus is DevSecOps for firmware. For those who don't know what firmware is, it is software that runs the physical devices inside of your machine
or watch,
or inside of your watch or IoT devices, right? And so that's an example of a code or application that you wouldn't have thought required DevSecOps, but yet it is. So, in my opinion, yep, I don't think there's any software-based service or application that doesn't need it.
Okay, it's do you have a different opinion?
No.
Aligned. Same for you, Paul?
Completely agree. I don't think there's a single thing. If you're running firmware, you're probably gonna get hacked at some point. It's apparently IoT is one of the biggest vulnerability areas and has been for years. So now people are desperately trying to lock that down. So completely agree.
Okay. Any other questions in the room? Okay. One of the things we've realized with Kinetic Skunk is there's an audience which is equally split between senior executives and those who are starting the journey in the IT space. And there's a third, which is a mix, right? But it's so focus on those 2/3, those that the more seasoned side of their career and those who are getting into it. What about suggestions or recommendations on how to move into this particular domain within the tech space. Gavin?
If you're starting, it's actually pretty simple. So at the start, release early, release often, release safely. Figure out how to do those things and do those things well. And you're already a long way down the track for this. Other than that, find someone who knows what they're doing, like a really good person, and annoy the hell out of them so you learn everything you can from them. Absolutely everything. Like the seasoned people they need to be your best friends if you're starting out on this journey. You can do a lot of this yourself, you can do a lot of research, you can do a lot of reading. Actually working with a really good person is probably the shortest way to upskill yourself. As far as I'm aware right now in South Africa, there is no tertiary institution providing anything on this unless you know of any.
Yep.
I'm not aware of any. So it's not like you can subscribe to a summer course from 2U or T and like suddenly become upskilled at this. It doesn't exist. There are a few international ones. You can watch things on Udemy. You can maybe attend like some of the free Harvard lectures. There's a couple of guys there that are actually really good at what they do. But that's how you're going to learn. And also by doing this, like actually doing this day in and day out. It's the only way you learn these things really well is by using it and implementing. And again, like I said, find a senior person, sit next to them. You'll be amazed at what they've already forgotten, the stuff you still have yet to learn.
On that last note, you'd be amazed what you still have left to learn. I think the same is true of those who are more experienced in their careers as well, right? I was going to say, is there such a thing as a DevSecOps expert? And let's say that there probably isn't, right? Because you continue to learn. So what would you suggest in terms of those who are trying to close gaps, Paul, in terms of trying to stay on the, keep in the know with what's changing from a tech perspective, what needs to be looked at from a security or vulnerability perspective? Just keeping, at the top of your game. What's your recommendation for companies and leaders out there?
I would say obviously read, but there's certain sources. There's the DORA set of metrics and reviews that are going on. I think stay abreast of those sort of things that are happening, and just talk to other people. I think in events like this, it's fantastic. I have monthly calls with the GitLab account manager, and they continuously informing me of new developments in their area. And of course, they're big players in this. So they keep on sort of dragging my attention to things that I think are necessary. And then I'm very blessed to have a very passionate team of DevOps engineers. We have a focused set of DevOps engineers that build our CI/CD pipelines. And they stay abreast all the time. They're always learning, always reading, and then always delivering. It's just awesome to have them. So I think that's key as well. Make sure that the teams that you're working with, all of our people, bar one, are ex-software engineers with a passion for this kind of thing. I think that makes all the difference.
As you would in any tech domain, plenty of acronyms coming out in CI/CD, talking about DORA metrics as well. So I think it's worth delving into those at some point, but it's one of those where, and our discussion is not going to do justice in such a complex topic, right? I'm surprised nobody's put on this word cloud. Obviously, for those of you who haven't entered your responses, we said, how are you feeling after this chat? And nobody said confused or anxious. I'm feeling somewhat confused, but also somewhat motivated. Okay, what we'll do is we'll leave open the next Menti, which is just any more detailed feedback you'd like to have on the session or any future topics you think would be important that you'd like to cover. And while we're doing that, we'll ask the audience to think of a final question that they may have. Does anybody have a burning question now? Okay, while you're thinking of that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share a closing comment on the topic or potentially a direction that they think those who are listening should pursue. You want to go first?
Sure. I'll focus on those who are starting on the software engineering journey. Like, so there's quite a few things that you can get into in terms of writing better code, etc., doing research around solid principles, writing good unit tests. So I mentioned it earlier, being skilled at writing good unit tests just means that you're going to write maintainable and testable code. Because if you have a complex, complex methods, and to write a test for that is you have to write a complex test, right? And that's going to cost you, right? So those are the smaller things that you can do. And then very simple thing, which I don't think they teach at tertiary institution, is actually managing your code, like using Git, using branching strategies and stuff. Because all of these sort of, I call it first principles, makes it easier for you to be absorbed into a dev team, right? Where you understand branching strategies, you understand how to write good unit tests, etc. Right? It makes it much easier for you to enter into those teams, and for the Scrum Masters to be, and your fellow team members to be confident in the code that you're writing, because you adhere to a certain set of software engineering principles. And when it comes to security and stuff, it's really easy to include if you're doing some Java dev, to include in your Gradle or your Maven setup stages to scan the code, to scan the code that you've written, the code that's coming from third-party dependencies. And I know GitLab is really good at that. And another aspect that it does is you can scan your code for license requirements of the packages that you pull in, because some might be GPL, so some might not be GPL. So those obviously have impacts. So just thinking about mitigating risk, right? The little steps that you can do yourself makes it so much easier for a young software engineer, to be assimilated into other agile or software dev teams.
Closing thoughts. Find someone really good at this. I learn all the time. I feel like a complete novice every time I speak to a really experienced person in this particular environment. I've never gotten to the point where it's like, oh, absolutely, I know exactly what's going on with everything, because I find it impossible. There are too many specialists out there for you to be a specialist at everything. The guys that are really good, they are really good. It's phenomenal working with them. Every single time you work with these really highly skilled people, you leave every session with them going, wow, that was amazing. And it's find those people, like surround yourself by as many of them as possible. Ask them the questions that you think are stupid. Please. A lot of, in any session like that, there's 10 of you in that session, 9 of you are thinking about the same question. Only 1 of you is prepared to ask it. So make sure you're asking those questions. If you don't know anything, ask it. It's the only way you're going to learn.
Perfect. And from your side, Paul?
So everything that's been said, absolutely agree with. But additionally, just like to be clear, I think it came up a bit in the call as well. DevSecOps is not going to go away. I think the sophistication level of bad actors is increasing. And if you're building software and it's being publicly used, you have a responsibility to make sure that it is secure and less vulnerable to these bad actors. And of course, they're always evolving. So I'm particularly excited to see where something like artificial intelligence is going to play a role. I think it is. in this area in DevSecOps, and so very keen to see that. But if you're not doing it, my suggestion would be to just start, build a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline, and then start evolving it, start getting it, you can add static analysis scans. I think we touched a bit on what could be SonarQube for a lot of your libraries, but GitLab has excellent libraries as well. That's maybe the key, is make sure you're selecting tools that aren't going to cost you arm and a leg everywhere. GitLab costs our company an arm and a leg, but it's a one-stop shop for getting everything we need. If we previously, before GitLab, we were using Bitbucket and various other disparate technologies, Black Duck for security scanning and all of those kind of things. And of course, we were paying those fees all separately. Now you've got them all in one place in GitLab, and they're constantly working to try and make sure that they integrate open source libraries, the Dast libraries, for example, or the SAS libraries that they're using. Incidentally, if you don't know, static analysis secure thing, if I'm not mistaken, what the acronym stands for. It's basically analyzing your code statically for vulnerabilities. They're using open source libraries, but they constantly update, And of course, if you don't like that, you can go and integrate it into your pipeline. You can add your own, and that's very important. So yeah, just dig in, get involved, start doing it on a small level, and then the mountain will be less arduous as you embark on this journey.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. So thank you, Donovan, Gavin, and Paul. Great discussion. Obviously, it seems like it's only the start of this discussion. Some great suggestions on where to look from Tariq in the chat as well. Just leaving the Kinetic Skunk LinkedIn page and website up here. Stay tuned. There'll be follow-on discussions on this topic, but also on cloud ops, site reliability engineering, and also some industry-specific stuff to look at how some of this impacts, let's say, retail, financial services, etc. So with that, thank you very much. Thanks to those in the room for joining, and thanks to those online. Have a great day.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks for having me.